I was a kid that was really good at school. I started college when I was 14. By the time I was 23, I had a PhD in physics from Princeton, a master's degree in mathematical economics, also from Princeton, a master's degree in geophysics and space physics from UCLA, and a bachelor's degree in math. A friend of mine used to say I was trying to have more degrees than a thermometer, which, ultimately I failed, but I did get a lot of degrees.
Nathan, this is such a delight to have you here. Thank you for making time to come on our show.
Oh, my pleasure.
You probably don't know this, but you and I have already met. And we met about over a decade ago, about 12 years ago. And this is my story, right? I was speaking at this conference and I was very nervous. We were launching our startup in the backstage. So I'm waiting there, waiting to be mic'd up and just pacing back and forth, trying to practice my lines, just very, very nervous. At that time, at least, I'd not done a lot of public speaking events. And so I was like, oh my God, this is going to be terrible. Everyone's going to laugh at me. You come up. And I see you wearing a badge, but the badge was turned around, so I had no idea who you were. Obviously, we know you. We've known you for years, but I don't know how you look like. So you walk up, and you're like, hi, I'm Nathan. And I'm like, oh, the mic guy is finally here. He's going to mic me up. And so I'm like, yes, hi, Nathan. And I'm like, okay, let's get this going. Let's get set up. And you're like, so what are you here for? I'm like, oh, I'm speaking. I'm launching my company. He's like, oh, what kind of company is this? I'm like, wow, this mic guy is so chatty. I just want to be done. Why is he talking to me? What is going on? And I'm just in my mind, just trying to be got to focus. And then I realized that you don't actually mic me up and you walk away and you go stand off in this corner. And I'm like, huh? Okay. And then this other guy comes in, mics me up, gets set up. So I go up on stage, do my whole presentation. It goes well. Finish the whole thing, launch the startup. Everyone says, thank you, applause, whatever. Get off the stage, go all the way around and go sit in the last row in the audience, this big auditorium in Southern California. And then I go see, okay, who's on stage? And I sit there just catching a breath. There's you. And and you're on stage sitting there. I think Kara Swisher is interviewing you, and she's like, welcome, Nathan Myhrvold. And I'm like, God damn it. This was Nathan Myhrvold. I totally messed up this opportunity to talk to you. But later on that evening, I came in and I was like, I'm so sorry. I thought you were the mic guy. And
the mic guy. Did not do it. Did not mic you up.
But that was my first in-person meeting of you. And, since then, we've always wanted to have you on the show and, just talk to you. This is our bucket list, dream guest kind of episode. So thank you for making the time and for talking to me then and being so chatty about understanding my stuff.
Okay. I'm glad it all worked out.
I'm glad it all worked out too. So Nathan, who are you and what do you do? Let's start there.
Well, I thought this was going to be simple questions. I sometimes have this problem if I'm at a cocktail party or some other context where people don't know me and they say, well, what do you do? And I never know quite what to say because there's many things I could say, but if I say too many of them, they're just going to think this guy's a liar. Oh, there's something wrong.
Yeah. Yes.
So I could say I'm a cookbook writer. And I am. Yes, I write some of the world's largest cookbooks. I hope they're actually really good at cookbooks also, but they're indisputably, they're the world's largest cookbooks.
Yeah. Definitely the most gorgeous, intricate
Beautiful
photography
cookbooks.
in any cookbook ever.
Including Modernist Pizza that released a couple years ago. Yeah. It's awesome. It's great.
Yeah, I just released one very recently called Food and Drink, which is just food photos. There's no recipes in that one.
Nice.
But I also study dinosaurs. So I do research on dinosaurs, and I take photographs all over the world of all sorts of things. Food for my next book will be on pastry. So
beautiful.
I'm eating and photographing pastry all over the world. And we're learning how to make it here and figure out scientific things about it and so forth. And I also, if you're in the tech industry, I used to be the first chief technology officer of Microsoft. I guess I'll always be the first one. But anyway, I haven't done that for many years. And then there's a ton of other things I do research on, or I also run a tech company called Intellectual Ventures. We've invented lots of cool new stuff.
Building a nuclear reactor on the side. That's like a hobby project.
Yeah. When we were doing the homework for this episode, first of all, you're like a really hard guest because just the introduction for you is like so confusing. Like, where do you even start? And then there are 7, maybe a dozen different, totally unconnected topics that we need to talk to you about. But maybe a really good place to start is your childhood. Because when a lot of people are maybe partying and hanging out with their friends, you finish college in your teen years. And then, you go on to, if I remember, actually work for Stephen Hawking for a little bit of time.
Yeah.
So walk me through that period of time. And I have to ask, what was it like to work for Stephen Hawking?
I was a kid that was really good at school. I started college when I was 14. By the time I was 23, I had a PhD in physics from Princeton, a master's degree in mathematical economics, also from Princeton, a master's degree in geophysics and space physics from UCLA, and a bachelor's degree in math.
Wow.
So a friend of mine used to say I was trying to have more degrees than a thermometer, which, ultimately I failed, but I did get a lot of degrees. And then, the last of those was in physics, and I was a postdoctoral researcher with Stephen Hawking. And you asked what it's like to work with Stephen Hawking. Well, the thing about Stephen is he's brilliant. There's many brilliant physicists, of course, but he's particularly brilliant. But the other thing about Stephen is, of course, he lived with enormous physical challenges. He was stricken with ALS, sometimes also called Lou Gehrig's disease. It's a horrible disease where you lose control of the motor parts of your body. But the autonomic nervous system, so the things keep you breathing and blood pumping, well, those still work. So you're alive, but you're kind of trapped in your own body. And yet, despite that, Stephen had just the best attitude you could imagine. He loved telling jokes. He wanted to figure out what, the fundamental physics of the world. So as a result, it was very hard to feel sorry for yourself working for Stephen.
Yeah.
And even since then, you think, oh God, I've had a terrible day. Nothing's going my way. And you're like, but wait, I can walk.
Yes. Yeah. You have no excuses.
Myself. Yeah. I can, it just, so to accomplish what he did under such incredible challenges is really an amazing story of this human spirit. So amazing, I decided my human spirit just isn't quite as great as his. But that's okay.
One of the things, I was looking at your back on that era, right? Like, at what age did you realize that you were capable of things that the average 12, 13, maybe earlier kid was not perhaps capable of? And I'm curious how that may have shaped you, because you have such a unique, teenager upbringing and time.
There's plenty of things where I make mistakes, or I think afterwards, oh, you should have done this. So it's not like, oh yeah, I think of myself as a genius. I actually kind of think of myself as more of an idiot, to be honest. But I was really good at school, and that was pretty straightforward. When I was very little, it took lots of courage for me to contradict the teacher if the teacher was wrong, but I would sometimes do that. And I would get bored if the stuff was too slow. And so that's why they kept having me skip grades. And there were some people who, at the schools that I went, and said, oh, if you skip the grades, you're just going to become a horrible, misshapen adult. And maybe they were right. But I was fairly adamant that I wanted to keep learning things, and I wouldn't keep learning things if they held me back for no reason. I remember there was one thing where the teachers, a couple of the teachers, not all of them, some of the teachers really liked me, but one of the teachers and the head of the school had to meet with me and my mom, and they wanted me to hold me back for my own good. So repeat a whole year. That seemed like torture.
Mm.
And I said, well, okay, but I'm not the weirdest kid in the class. How many people who are the right age for the class in theory, who are all just as, arguably less well-adjusted than I, how many of them are you holding back?
Yeah.
They said, well, and I said, so, this is just, unfortunately, wokeism hadn't developed the part where I could have said they were being ageist. But they were being ageist. Now, ageist with a 9-year-old, but still.
Yeah.
I didn't want to be frustrated, doing stuff that was just way too easy. And even though they skipped me in grades, it was always still too easy. But at least it was a little bit better when I could, do 2 years for every one, or I could do. And then, of course, I had lots of other interests and things on the side. I started being interested in cooking when I was around 9, photography also when I was around 9. And I read very extensively in all kinds of topics besides what was the literal schoolwork. There are people who say that it's bad for children in general. They don't recommend doing that. It's very hard for me to say because I've only grown up one way.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
You can't. If I was part of an identical twins, you could have done this ghoulish experiment where you treated one of us one way and the other one a different way, and maybe that would give you some kind of a hint. But as it was, I have always been happy that I took the path that I did.
Yeah.
See, I never was the weirdest kid in class. Yeah, I was a really bookish, nerdy, studious student who wasn't one of the cool kids.
Yeah.
But I always had other friends that were just like that.
Right.
And so, okay, they were 2, 3, 4, 5 years older than I was. But so, I think quite correctly, there's been a lot of focus since the time I was young on dealing with the special challenges that some kids have. And of course, some kids have a learning disability. So they have something like dyslexia. They have other things. And of course, it's great to cater to those things. There's usually much less attention to catering to smart kids. And yet the smart kid is being just as disadvantaged in some way. And it's sort of like, oh, well, they're smarter than they need to be anyway. They'll figure it out, or the hell with them, or I don't know what. But there's much less focus on that. So I'm happy that the teachers and people around me saw fit to let me continue in school. I certainly know other smart people or other people who did well in school who just got bored because they stayed in the same age. They were not allowed to go ahead. They got super bored, and then that led to them sometimes doing really useful things, but often doing useless and self-destructive things because they were bored from school and they dropped out, and so on and so forth.
You kind of have this amazing, time frame where you work for Stephen Hawking, and then a few years later, to your point, you wind up, in the early days of Microsoft. So maybe one place I want to start there is, what is your first memory and impression of meeting Bill Gates?
I met Bill Gates at a point where I started a little company, which was way harder to get companies funded back in the 80s. So this would be 84, I think we started.
It'd be much easier now, by the way. If somebody with your background...
Way easier now. Yeah, way harder then. But my little company had technology that Microsoft was interested in, so I went up to meet with Microsoft about it, and they kept having me meet with people and then rearranging the schedule. And so eventually they had me go meet with Bill. I got along really well with him. He asked lots of questions, and I was able to answer those questions. And one of the interesting things is my little company people had sought to acquire us once before, and that deal kind of fell apart. And it wasn't clear that would have worked out. And I said, well, the good news is I think Microsoft really needs us, but I think they also want us and would actually use us, because sometimes you can have something where it says, oh, yes, we want that, but
we don't really
we're actually kind of antithetical. The company's culture is antithetical to actually using what you get.
Right.
And this one, that seemed like it worked out. And of course, history was it did work out
This is something that we think about on founders, which is like a big sort of our listeners, right? And we talk to people when they are fundraising, when they're trying to go sell their business and that kind of thing. And this comes up often as like a topic for us where it's like, when do you go sell your business? Or how do you go think about acquirers? How do you go scale? That kind of thing. So it's really cool that you got that experience once where you had like this acquisition on the table, but then you got to eventually ended up working with Bill Gates, which worked out really well for us in retrospect.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, we wouldn't have we wouldn't have like been together, which is really important. Obviously, and have our careers without all of that.
And Microsoft was super formative for us. We spent our first, a year before we graduated, we got into Microsoft and moved to Seattle and just ended up like, this was our initial framework for how companies should be run, how large-scale businesses should be run is all based off of Microsoft. And we work with some really smart people, really humble, nice people, super smart. And it's just this like time in our lives that we just set it in stone. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And the reason why, we have such fun, actually, what I was telling Nathan before we started, like when I joined Microsoft, I went and looked up all the Microsoft lore. And Nathan is a key part of Microsoft lore. And I joined like maybe many, many years after you had left and gone on to do other things, because your memos and documents and stories about you would be spread through the hallways and the email servers. When you look at your role back then, in some ways, a lot of people remember, mythologize in many ways is your roadkill on the information superhighway memo, you writing about having a phone in every pocket. There are multiple emails of yours. Yep. Maybe let's start with this. What is the secret to writing a great memo?
First of all, it depends on what your audience is. Okay. I used to say that being a tech visionary is writing sci-fi with a really boring plot, but with the virtue that it's trying to be true.
Right.
Now, it's also true, though, that if you wanted to be a tech visionary that gets widely quoted in the media, generally the way to do that is to avoid the trying to be true part, because you get much more play the more outlandish things are. So, if you say, gee, I think self-driving cars will be really important in the coming decades, that's too reasonable, as opposed to saying, oh, there'll be 1 million self-driving taxis, in 12 months from now.
Yeah.
Which fairly famously has been claimed. And the interesting thing is, in the context of the audience making headlines, very few people come back and ask you afterwards. So there's no downside to just lying through your teeth. Whereas what I was trying to do with Microsoft was to make really, when I would write those memos, I was trying to predict what the future of the industry would be in a way that would be very, very come true in a short enough time frame that would matter to us. It also isn't very useful in the context of a company to predict stuff that's 20 years away. First of all, it's so uncertain, who the hell knows? But even if you did know 100%, what does it matter, right? It's 20 years is way too long a time frame. So I did predict correctly many of the big developments, maybe most of the big developments in certainly the personal computer industry, and some more generally than that.
Maybe one good one to kind of go deeper on is, and maybe I would say is maybe one of the more famous ones, is just roadkill on the information superhighway. So walk me through just maybe the time and the place and the setting and how that came about and the aftermath.
We knew that there's a couple of different things happening, right? One was that it was clear that PCs were becoming more and more and more capable for doing what would traditionally be called entertainment. So you could play video. And back then it was shitty looking video compared to what we get today, but there was video. And games were getting more and more realistic, and it was not a giant leap to say, this more realistic thing is going to keep going until it's as good as animated movies, and then it's going to blow past that to be, eventually it'll be indistinguishable from a movie shot with a camera.
Mm.
And you were going to have electronic networks that connected all of us, which in the era that I wrote that, the internet was still nascent, but growing. But there was also cable TV, and cable TV had gone from an analog thing to where it was clear at that point already that the next generation was going to be all digital. That set of things was going to change almost everything in the certainly in the entertainment, but more generally in the information-oriented businesses. Now, information-oriented businesses then and now you could also call media-oriented businesses. And those have been very, very shaped by the notion that there were bottlenecks and a small number of bottlenecks. So you would apply to various publishers to get your book published. It was hugely difficult to get your book published. There was a book that was a bestseller and won a National Book Award that was written. It's called The Confederacy of Dunces, a tragic story written by a guy who couldn't get it published, became despondent, killed himself. His mother convinced the University of Louisiana Press to publish it because she found a professor who loved the book. And it was a damn bestseller. Mm. And so the whole process that denied that person a chance during his lifetime then ultimately built his legacy. Another great example was Stephen Hawking. Mm-hmm. Okay, the same year that Stephen publishes A Brief History of Time, which is about the effects of quantum mechanics on the origin of the universe and the origin of time. Madonna publishes a book called Sex, and it has pictures of her naked in it, including in a compromising way with a German Shepherd. Now, which of those two things you think is going to sell more? And suppose it turned out Stephen's book was published by Cambridge University Press, so Madonna never called her for that book, so they were not direct competitors.
Right.
But just imagine they were direct competitors. Well, the fact is Stephen's book outsold Madonna's by like a factor of 10.
Wow. Okay.
And that's what I used to say back at the time, and it's in that memo, is if you're trying to guess what the public likes, it's not just hard, it's actually impossible. And the people who do it out of a fear for being criticized because, oh my God, we only have, a publisher only has a small number of books that they can put out every year.
Yeah.
At the time, there were only 3.5 TV networks. And there was only, mostly you wanted prime time because getting at 2 a.m. it was really hard to get an audience.
Yeah.
So there's a very tiny number of TV shows, and there was even fewer movies made. And in all of those cases, it was distribution of the information that was this big bottleneck. And that bottleneck both prevented good things from reaching a wide audience, but it also it tremendously restricted what the diversity of things were, and that's diversity in every way, both in the modern sense of diversity, but how much room is there for quantum physicists writing about the origin of the universe and time? Okay. If you have only a limited number of slots, you don't do that.
Yeah.
So I said, hey, this is going to totally change all aspects of media and publishing. And there was a bunch of examples that I had in there. I said, look, the newspaper business at the time was this very funny thing where they made all of their money on classified and display ads. But they actually pretended, fortunately, there was this sort of bizarre thing in the industry that they said, no, it's actually about the journalism. So we'll pay journalists, we'll have this Pulitzer Prize thing that was about rewarding journalists, and we'll put tons of effort in, and we'll have high journalistic standards. And the whole thing was funded by ads to tell you what was on sale at the local supermarket or the local auto dealer, and classified ads for people selling used cars or looking for a date or whatever. And of course, those ads were terrible as a user experience. Okay, they would use this tiny print, and you'd have to look at it with a magnifying glass usually, and then there would be all of these abbreviations that people would use because you didn't want to spell words out all the way because it was so expensive and blah blah blah. I was like, hey, that's all going to totally change. That's all going to be dead. And then what about the TV things? As it stands, books were at the time infinitely more available than TVs or video. Books would stay in print for many years. Not true for TV or movies. You'd sometimes get reruns and things, but way more limited than books. And there were things called libraries where you could go get stuff. And I said, well, what happens to the world of movies, video, TV, and music when you can put everything online at all times? The internet was around and it was growing, but the focus at the time was on the information superhighway, of which the internet was viewed as one aspect and cable TV was another aspect and so forth. And so I used the highway metaphor, and I used the idea of roadkill. And then that people at Microsoft told other people about it, even though the memo was in principle confidential. And so, who knows, maybe someone used the idea, roadkill and the information highway a decade before me. I've got no idea. But so far as I know, that metaphor was my own, and it became very widely used that, hey, all of these companies were going to be roadkill. And of course, that caused all those companies to say, oh, that's all bullshit. The funniest was the music industry, which says, oh, no, we'll never allow that to happen. And I'm like, yeah, you and what army, buddy? That's going to happen. I didn't think that the music industry would go away because people like to listen to music. But the way in which it was monetized and
having these gatekeepers, and not having democratized access, like you're seeing this push in every industry for people just wanting to reach their audience, go direct, not have these middlemen and gatekeepers. And music is like the prime example.
Gatekeepers had an impossible job. Okay, there was no way they were going to satisfy both the broad set of interests that people have, nor were they very likely to take a bet on saying, I got one more book to do. Should I do Madonna, the biggest superstar of the era? Or should I do Stephen Hawking? When in retrospect, we know the right decision is Stephen Hawking.
Or, the answer was both. Just in the Microsoft, it's interesting because a lot of people who are watching this, they have lived with Microsoft their entire life. Like somebody joined Microsoft recently and they said their code base they're working on is older than them, which kind of made me feel old. But you were at a very different era of Microsoft in the 90s and the 80s. For maybe founders and builders watching now, what do you think were underappreciated parts about Microsoft culture, the way folks like you, Bill, some of the people around then, like Jeff Rakes, there's a bunch of these folks around then. What do you think is underappreciated about how you operated?
Well, I think Microsoft, particularly in that era, I'm not the company now, but a lot of the same spirit is there. It was as close to a technical meritocracy as you could get. I mean, there's any organization with humans in it means there's always going to be some amount of human friction and so forth. Politics. But there was just a dramatic reduction in any degree of office politics. At the time, all of the other tech companies, virtually every single one, not 100%, but very close, were run by people who were the suits, who really didn't understand anything about the fundamental technology. And those people they were useful in some ways. And Microsoft had business people too, of course. But it's very hard to manage something really well if you don't have a almost visceral understanding of the phenomenon and what the power and potential is. At some point I was at Microsoft, I was making a pitch about pocket PCs, which is what we I called it the wallet PC, but I said it would have cellular connections and email would be a big thing. And I was giving a presentation on this at the executive retreat. And one of the other senior Microsoft executives said, okay, Nathan, just stop right there. There's going to be what? There's going to be like 1 million of these sold every year. It's going to be like a Sharp Wizard or some other little gadget. And maybe in our dreams, we get $10 each. So it's like $10 million a year. So why should we bother with any of this? And so I draw in my breath. And before I can speak, Bill Gates speaks up and he says, so what was your estimate of the total size of the PC market in 1975? The guy just shuts up and I just went on with my talk. And Bill played a very important role because besides the direct decisions that he made, there was like a no bullshit factor that came from that. And inevitably, when you're making an important decision, particularly an important decision early on, there's going to be a diversity of opinion. There's going to be people who say that's brilliant, and people say, oh, that's a terrible idea. We should do this instead. I think most people understood at Microsoft, most of the technical people in the management, that there'd be a fair hearing and that Bill would hear it out and there would be something that would be based on the technical merits of it. And that technical merits was from someone who really understood both that, but also was able to make a visionary call. And the visionary call that Bill had made long before I met him was the idea of graphical user interface. He'd seen the graphical user interface work at Xerox PARC. It was so much better than character mode PCs. He said, we're going to go all in for that. That was one of the big bets that Microsoft made that the rest of the industry didn't. And they didn't because they had people who were, primarily, they had people who were business people who said, but we're making so much money on this, we don't want to rock the boat. Why should we go change all of this? Why should we do it? Microsoft was almost unique among tech companies, even to this day. Not totally unique, but very close to it, in having multiple successful products. The typical tech company at that era, and still many of them today, have one product that is, 80% of revenue and 120% of profits, because everything else they do loses money. And, I think that would be, if you looked at Oracle, now you could have a reasonable discussion about saying, well, how do you divide between the Oracle database sales and the customization consulting around it? Is that two things or one thing? But Oracle's a company that has tried to do other stuff. And by acquisitions, they've added some things that I think have worked out for them.
Yes.
But it was very difficult. In much earlier era, Lotus 1-2-3 was the dominant spreadsheet. Microsoft's spreadsheet at the time was something called Multiplan, which was nowhere near that. But Microsoft said, okay, we're not going to make a character mode version of Multiplan to chase Lotus 1-2-3. We're going to make Excel, which should be fundamentally graphical. And it was this giant bet. And there are lots of people in the company who were like, why are we making this huge bet? Graphical user interface doesn't work yet. And it's too slow. And it's too They had great programmers at Lotus and great technical people, just more generally. But it was very hard for them to make a competitor to Lotus 1-2-3 because it would threaten their key
business,
key product. And so, they came out with a very innovative thing called Javelin. Javelin was not a spreadsheet, but it was another idea for saying, how could you do simple mathematical models of a business?
Right.
So I view spreadsheets as a programming language. It's a programming language that lets you write a very simple program. And the graphical metaphor of having a 2D grid maps really well to the way people think about things, to traditional accounting. In the old days, what accountants would have is they would have a big pad of paper, and you could go to the back of a stationery store, and they would have these things. They were called columnar pads, and they some of them would be huge. They'd be 17 by 11 or something, and they would all have all of these columns so that you could put in columns for different costs and different things for making big ledgers.
Right.
And people would be entering all that, and then using a hand calculator, a mechanical device or electromechanical, to do the actual tallying up of things. Well, at Lotus, I think, and many other companies, they succumbed to two different things. One was to say, okay, Joe here Jill wants to go start a new product thing. And we could put 10 good people on there.
Right.
But if we made the sales of our main product 1% better, it'd be vastly more than Jill's product could ever bring in.
Makes
So why don't we just make our main thing 1% better?
Yeah, exactly.
And it's not wrong, by the way.
Yeah.
Except for two things. One is the incremental 10 people that you give, even if it's 10 really good people, at a certain point, you're better off making that bet in a different area, because they're more likely to contribute 0.1% than 1% to that new thing. Not always.
Not always, but yeah.
But so pile on your main thing. But the problem is, it will tend to lead you to pile onto your main thing with a large bloated team that then loses the incremental 10 people actually cost you productivity. Or was very inefficient productivity compared to saying, let's take 10 people off to start a new program and see how that goes.
Yeah, makes sense.
And you had to worry about threatening them, right?
Yeah,
I mean, there were still people working on Multiplan. We were working on Excel, and they were like, what the fuck? Multiplan was nowhere in the United States, but it was the number one spreadsheet in Europe. And we made tons of money on Multiplan. I'm like, hey, we chopped liver. We're making all this money.
Yeah, it's so hard to think of cannibalizing yourself. Okay, I want to do a massive topic shift, right? Because there's cooking, there's dinosaurs, there's nuclear plants, there's asteroids.
I was going to say, people have hobbies, right? You have hobbies, I have hobbies, we have hobbies. I started out when I was a kid, stamp collecting, and then slowly upgraded from there. I love photography too. I now have 3 or 4 Leica cameras, which I'm really proud of, and do a lot of work there. But, it is very much a hobby. You take hobbies to the next level, right? And it's it puts all of us to shame.
Yeah.
I want to pick one specific hobby. And, for folks who have not seen this, you have to watch, your TED Talk from, 14 years ago now. And you talk a lot about archaeology, bird poop.
Lots of bird poop.
There's a ton of stuff there. But I want to talk about cooking. And modernist cuisine.
Yeah.
What started this whole thing? Why do you do what you do specifically in this area of cooking?
First of all, I have this general principle that if it's worth doing, it's worth doing to the best of your ability. Now, I don't apply that to absolutely everything, because it's not like, well, yeah, I got to go to the grocery store, but I don't know what it would mean to go to the grocery store to the best of my ability, or the gas station or some other, yes, I go to the dentist to the best of my ability. But when it comes to something like photography or cooking or other things, I like doing it really well. So I was into cooking since I was 9. At 9, I told my mom I was going to cook Thanksgiving dinner all by myself. And I did.
Wow. Okay. That might be the most impressive part of your resume overall. Ever.
So I was self-taught in cooking. And then at some point when I was at Microsoft, I realized I had all of these degrees and all these topics, but I'd never gone to cooking school. So I actually got billed to give me a leave of absence from Microsoft to attend chef school in France.
Wow.
Okay.
It's amazing.
So I went and I did that. Then I came back and then worked at Microsoft for many more years. After I retired from Microsoft, I built a house and I had a big state-of-the-art kitchen. And I knew that there were a bunch of people doing new, innovative types of cooking that was inspired at least by science to one degree or another. And I had eaten at some of their restaurants, and I knew that was going on. And I naively thought, hey, I should learn this because, I had this degree in French cooking from the top school in France. Well, why don't I go figure this out too? Right? There was no big book. Now, if there had been a big book about that topic, I would have bought it. I would have been happy. That I would be still a very serious cook, person who loved cooking. But I realized that not only was there no big book, but there was tremendous amounts of misunderstanding about cooking. Even though I'd gone to this school that was all about, passing along this cherished knowledge of French chefs from centuries of experience, and these people knew how to cook, actually they didn't. The thing that's amazing about people is that people have been able to figure stuff out semi-empirically before they actually had the theories to figure it out. And cooking is maybe one of the extreme examples of that. Things that occur in cooking occur because of complex chemical reactions, complex physics. It's really hard to figure out. But people are like, well, let's just kind of try it. And like, hey, by the way, this works pretty well. And then over time, they start experimenting more. And so we learned how to do lots of very complicated things. When modernist cuisine came out, one reporter who was very critical of it interviewed me, and they said, oh, this is all about this complicated science. Why don't you do something simple? And I said, well, like what simple food do you mean? They said, oh, like having a glass of wine with cheese and bread. And I laughed at the guy because I said, cheese and bread and wine are like the three most complicated things in all of cooking.
Yeah.
And first of all, if you don't believe it, I invite you to go try. But second of all, there's a fundamental reason, which is those are biotech projects. Yeah. They're all about fermenting. And through long, hard experience, people have figured a lot of things out empirically about how to make good cheese, wine, and bread. But it's tricky stuff. It turns out that even though people have figured that out, they actually didn't know the half of it.
Yeah.
Okay. I've never thought we'd ask a cooking question on our show, but let me ask you this. Somebody watching this and who has never done anything beyond a microwave, what is a deceptively simple, what is the first easy starter dish that you would recommend everyone here go master that would impress a guest?
Well, okay, the simplest thing I tell people to do, although it won't necessarily impress a guest unless they're a guest for breakfast, but maybe those are the ones you want to impress the most.
Hey, after a special night over, the breakfast really counts.
Make scrambled eggs. Do this one thing with the scrambled eggs, which is most people would make 3 scrambled eggs for a portion. Maybe you have a fraction of that. Let's just say you're making 3 scrambled eggs. Do 2 whole eggs and 1 egg yolk. Separate the egg and just keep the yolk. Now, you haven't added anything to it. You've just subtracted 1 yolk. So you have slightly less volume, but it tastes remarkably better than it does with 3 whole eggs. It's crazy how much better it tastes.
So 2 whole eggs and 1 yolk. So you remove the egg white for one of them. Oh my God, I am trying this tomorrow. Okay.
It's so simple. And so in France, the technique for scrambled eggs is you usually add a bunch of butter or you add some cream to it. Yeah. And that's good. It tends to dilute the egginess. The yolk has more fat, so you've changed the proportion of fat, but you haven't added fat. You've actually just taken away some white. It's delicious. Now, the other thing is I would say then also stir. Some people do their scrambled eggs where they cook them quickly. Some do them where they cook them slowly. Yeah. Just stir a lot and take it off before you think it's done because it'll keep hardening up for the next 30 seconds to a minute after you take it off.
Amazing. No, it's true.
So it's really simple, but give it a try.
This might be folks. This might be the most useful bit in our podcast we've ever had. Okay. So I want to talk about dinosaurs and exploring the solar system. And because, you've been into archaeology a lot, and you're obviously, you've been talking about the need for exploring solar system. Maybe one quick question, which is, what do you think are the lessons for the human race that you think, we need to take from your study of dinosaurs and everything that has come before us? Like, what do you think we underappreciate?
The world of biology is way more diverse and strange than we have any way of knowing. That we have some familiarity with the animals that are alive today, not perfect, because we've driven a lot of them extinct, or of the animals alive today in Africa or India or other places around the world. There's a lot of weird animals, and they're cool, and I love those BBC wildlife documentaries.
Oh, yes. Yeah, love them.
Life the history of life shows it was so much weirder than that. And dinosaurs are one of the examples. These animals that were enormously larger than any land mammals that live today. Very different in lots of other ways. And yet they're totally gone. Mm. They were the dominant form of vertebrate life on Earth, animals with a background. It's really hard to beat beetles on numbers, but dinosaurs dominated the Earth for 150 million years. Human race has been around for, depending on how you count it, 1 million. Some people push it back a little bit. Some would make it a little bit shorter. We had some other close relative species that would take it back a few million.
Yeah.
So nothing like that period of time. And yet they all went away. And in fact, if you just looked at history, you'd say almost all species have gone extinct.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, there's some things, like famously cockroaches today and of course, many species of cockroaches have gone extinct over the years, but there are fossil cockroaches that look pretty much exactly like a cockroach today. Mm-hmm. So it was, the cockroaches will always be with us. And yeah, so far as we can tell, they will. But everything else has changed, and changed enormously.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And so I think that is one of the great lessons. Another great lesson is it's hard to figure out the aspects of those creatures. So, we've studied dinosaurs since the late 19th century, scientifically studied them. And we find brand new things that change our view all the time. Mm-hmm. There's roughly 800 species of dinosaurs that are known. But there's also a new species of dinosaur found roughly once a week. Mm. Typically 50 new species a year, and that's been going on for a long time. And that's partially a function of just how many people are looking for them. If you had more people looking for them, we'd find more. Mm-hmm. To compare that 800 species, there's 5,000 species of mammals, 10,000 species of birds, about 10,000 species of reptiles. So almost certainly, and that's just what's alive today, that 5 or 10,000, historically way more. So for dinosaurs over that 200 million years, we'll never find them all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Another thing that's funny about finding fossils is you find fossils when an animal dies and it gets covered up with mud or sand or something like that, and then layers form on top and it just turns to rock. Sand and mud only build up in areas where there's lots of erosion, and the erosion deposits things. Mm-hmm. So river deltas are great for us. We love digging in what was once a river delta.
Yeah.
We love digging in what was once a lake, because in a lake you have sediment that flows in from rivers that feed the lake, and it builds up. We know from the world today, there's lots of animals that live only in the mountains. Mm-hmm. Mountain goats, mountain sheep, mountain predators like the snow leopard. Dinosaurs must have had them.
Right.
We'll never find them.
Yeah. Wow.
Because mud and sand don't build up in the
mountains. Yeah.
They just don't.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's kind of always a debate about being a specialist in one field and going super deep. And obviously, you're maybe one of the best forms of the generalist. I am curious whether you going across so many domains, have you been able to use insights or patterns or techniques from one and apply that to another? And if so, I'm curious to hear a story.
I do tons of that.
Okay.
But you're right. Generally, the world wants you to learn more and more about less and less until you know everything about nothing. And that's what you get lots of awards for in general.
Right.
And I have friends who are chefs, friends who are dinosaur experts, friends that are physicists. And each of my friends can't figure out why I waste time and all that other shit. Okay, it's like, what's wrong with you, Nathan?
Yeah, there's a bunch of French chefs who are like, why do you care about all this software and nuclear stuff?
Exactly. Well, and just like the nuclear people say, why does he cook? I mean, Bill Gates is a huge friend of mine, but he's asked, you can tell he's trying to be sensitive and not to actually, so what is it that you find so interesting about cooking?
Yeah.
Hey, Bill, do you like the scrambled eggs or not?
Oh, he likes it when I cook for him, for damn sure. And he also says, and I think it's 100% true, my cookbooks are the only ones he's ever opened. I think that is going to remain true.
That is great. That is awesome.
Okay.
But anyway, yes, I always use a technique from one to another. I mean, the simplest thing is the scientific method.
Yeah.
It sounds like a super basic thing, but it's true.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stuff in cooking where people say, oh, X is true because of, and I always say, let's try that.
Yeah.
Let's just test it. Or you say, how do you know? Because there's a lot of things that people will intuit because people like to tell stories. And if you're the head chef, you get tired of the junior chef coming and saying, chef, why am I doing this?
Yeah.
So you make a story up.
Yeah.
And maybe even believe it yourself. But very few people test it. But besides that, I use statistics in almost everything I do. I use mathematical analysis in almost everything I do. One of the key things that sparked my modernist cuisine book originally was sous vide cooking.
Yeah.
For sous vide cooking, I had to figure out what the appropriate cooking times were. And I did both empirical tests of that, but I also wrote a lot of code and simulated the flow of heat through.
Wow. Amazing. Nathan, we have this time with you. It's almost coming to an end. We are at the last question part, which is terrible because we've just about scratched the surface.
Yeah.
So we should definitely come back. Like, you're one of those people where each one of these topics is going to be a separate episode by itself. But like you have exposure to so many different areas, so many different spaces as such. You clearly take learnings from one, apply to the other, and you do a lot of that. If you, for our audience, if you're a young person, you have a few years of experience, you're out of college, you're figuring out what you want to do. When you look at this time that they have in front of them, what do you think are the things that they should work on, problems they should be solving, areas that they should think about or invest in? Like, what advice would you give to them to focus their time on?
Yeah, that's a short question with a short answer. There's two levels that you can answer a question like this. So some of that is the kind of advice that your grandfather might tell you, pick things that you love,
Yeah.
pick things that you're good at.
Yeah.
It's usually hard to love something that you suck at because it's frustrating. You might be frustrated by something you also love, but hey, at least you love it. So, of course, those very broad things are true. I think there is a tendency to overthink things that people will have, particularly if they're smart people and they're focused. And they say, well, I'm going to have a plan. I'm going to do X, which is going to lead to Y. And I remember that I had friends in high school who had these very complicated life plans that I'm going to go to this school and that's going to get me into this graduate school. And then I'm going to do this and this. And you run into those people 20 years later and the numbers of them that actually did exactly what their plan was is small. It's not zero. And for some professions have the giant drawback that they make you decide too young. Being a medical doctor is that way. So the it's hard to be a medical doctor if you didn't decide in high school to get good grades, to get to the school that you would then get good grades in, so that you could then go get into medical school. I'm not sure that actually, as a society, that benefits us, because it's not. There are people who weren't that organized when they were
18,
in high
17,
school, who still would have made an excellent physician.
Yeah.
And a friend of mine who's a doctor likes to say, what do you call the person who graduated at the bottom of their medical school class?
A doctor?
Doctor.
Yeah.
Right. So, and after all of that rigmarole of selecting kids to go to medical school, a lot still flunk out or leave or go through the whole process and don't want to practice. If your heart is set on being a doctor, go ahead and be a doctor. But it's way more forgiving to realize that serendipity can happen.
Yeah.
As you two have told about how serendipity in the form of a job offer for Microsoft was very important to you.
Yeah.
And you've got to be open to that. And if you're not open to that, you're going to miss opportunities. And you never know. Those could be tiny opportunities. But if they're tiny ones, then as long as you're open to something else, you're not trapped.
Right.
And they could be really big ones that really change your life in a giant positive way.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you have to set that against the fact within the tech industry, now diving to a more focused thing, there's always fads du jour.
Mm.
And there were fads du jour in the 19th century in tech, okay? Used to be like electricity. Ooh, electricity. Now it's like, it's the most... When people say a double E, they don't want to be an electrician. They want us to, do advanced electronics. Not that there's anything wrong with electricians. We need them. But you have to also resist a little bit the fad du jour thing.
Right.
Now, sometimes the fad du jour is worth it. It's important. I mean, when the internet first arose, it was the fad du jour. And there were some people that dismissed it totally that way. But no, it was pretty clear to me and to others that the internet was going to last, and it did. Yeah. But there's other fads. There's a huge fad on something called push media.
Oh, yes. Wire had a famous cover,
Yes,
push.
Push with a picture of a hand.
Yeah, that didn't work out. I think one of the things which is so remarkable about you is you've kind of followed your passions and obviously have the capability to do so across so many fields, and they've been enduring. Like 100 years from now, an amazing scrambled egg is going to be as interesting as it is today. Exploring the solar system, if we survive, is going to be as interesting, and we'll probably still be finding dinosaurs. Nathan, I just want to say, we could probably go on for multiple hours. I mean, I think the word polymath...
We probably should. I think, Nathan, if you would have us, we'd love to do another episode with you and just start pick a few topics and go really deep in them, because we've kind of scattered ourselves across two things.
I'm busy, but try me again in a few months.
I will.
Yeah, we will. But Nathan, I just wanted to say, you are the person we want to be when we grow up.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, but see, you got something contradictory right there. You said grow up.
I like it.
When people ask me, where did you grow up? I always say, I'm amused you think I did. But I was young. I did it when I was young. That's unambiguous.
Oh, my gosh. Nathan, this was such a delight. And I can generally say, we often wonder, have we left somebody with anything useful in episodes? I know we have, because we're going to make some amazing eggs at the end of this. But no, you're just inspiring to us and for many, many years to everyone. And everyone, we're going to have links to Nathan's books, his TED Talk, and it just highly, highly recommend. Nathan, you're one of a kind. Thank you so much for doing this with us.
Thanks for spending time with us.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Bye.